On the edge of the plain stood a cabin of silence, where a woman bore bruises, not blessings, for giving birth to daughters. The plains were vast and merciless, stretching farther than the eye could follow. A horizon blurred by heat in summer and by snow in winter. It was there, on the edge of a weary town, that Mary lived out her days in silence beneath the hand of cruelty. Her husband had long despised her for the daughters she bore him. To him, each child was not a blessing but an offense, a mark of shame he laid upon her shoulders. He called it a curse, though the curse was his temper, his fists, the sharp edge of his tongue. With every birth came not joy but punishment, the echo of slammed doors, the sound of flesh striking flesh, the hollow silence afterward. Mary learned early to fold herself into smallness, to move as if her presence were an intrusion. Yet even in the shadows of fear she clung to her girls. Their little braids tied with faded ribbons were her defiance. Their soft hands clutching her skirts when storms rolled across the plains were her strength. In the hush of night, when the house smelled of wood smoke and fear, she hummed lullabies beside the hearth. She poured what courage she could into their hearts, hoping it might carry them where she herself could not go. The neighbors whispered when they saw her bruises, but they turned their eyes away, the way townsfolk often did when cruelty lived too close. Pity was easier than intervention. The preacher spoke of endurance. The women shook their heads but said nothing. Mary walked among them with her shawl drawn close, her bruises hidden beneath fabric, her silence heavy as stone. Days blurred into seasons. She patched her husband's shirts with trembling hands, cooked meals that went unpraised, and listened to the sound of boots pacing angrily across the floorboards. Outside, the wind carried the dust of the prairie into every crack of the house, settling in corners like a second skin. Inside, fear settled deeper still, yet Mary was not without fire. It burned low, deep within her chest, hidden even from herself. Sometimes, when she looked into her daughter's eyes, clear, bright, untarnished, she felt it flicker stronger. In those moments she bent close, whispering promises into their hair. "You will know love one day. You will not live as I have lived." The girls clung to those words, though they scarcely understood them. Eliza, the eldest, held her chin high, though her small frame trembled when her father's shadow darkened the door. Little Anna carried her rag doll everywhere, its patched face worn from clutching, a silent companion through the nights of fear. The youngest, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, mimicked her mother's lullabies, her soft voice breaking the silence when Mary herself could not. Mary bore her pain in silence, but the land bore witness. The fields stretched empty, neglected by the man who should have tended them. The fences sagged, posts leaning as if weary from holding their ground. Even the old rocking chair on the porch groaned with each movement, as though echoing the burden of the woman who sat within it during the late hours. In the deep of winter, the cabin walls held the cold more fiercely than they held warmth. Mary wrapped her daughters in quilts, their breath rising in pale clouds as they huddled together. She brewed coffee she scarcely touched, its bitterness filling the room more than its heat. Her husband's boots dragged heavy across the floor, and she braced herself with every step, never knowing if silence or violence would follow. But when the storms came, the true storms, not the tempers, Mary found a strange kind of kinship with them. She watched rain streak the windows, listened to thunder shake the sky, and thought, "Here is something greater than him, greater than me, greater than all this sorrow." And in that thought lay the faintest spark of freedom, a whisper of change carried on the wind. Mary endured, not because she was blind to her suffering, but because her daughter's survival was bound to hers. Each day she rose with the weight of duty pressing hard upon her. Yet each night she laid her head down with the quiet knowledge that she had bought her girls another day of life, another day closer to something better. Her world was silence and bruises, shawls and shadows, the ceaseless rhythm of dust against the windows. And yet deep within something waited, as patient as the earth itself, as unyielding as stone. Mary could not yet name it, but the story of her life was already shifting. The cruelty ended not with justice nor with mercy, but with ice. It was the dead of winter, a night when the river swelled dark and heavy beneath a crust of shifting frost. Mary's husband had gone to town and drink, boasting and raging until the saloon keeper turned him out into the bitter cold. He stumbled homeward through the drifts, cursing the world with every staggering step until the earth gave way beneath him. The river swallowed his cries and the ice closed over, silencing him forever. By morning, the town knew. They fished his body out with poles, stiff and gray, the whiskey still sharp on his breath. No tears were shed in the pulling. The preacher gave him words enough to fill a grave, but not enough to warm it. Mary stood at that grave, her daughters pressed close to her sides, their small boots sinking in the snow. The mound was soon covered, white upon white, the earth hiding him faster than grief could rise in her chest. She felt no freedom, no triumph, only a hollow ache, as if her years of pain had emptied her so thoroughly there was nothing left to feel. The town marked his passing with indifference. Some nodded, some muttered of God's will, but most carried on. Relieved, the man's fists and curses were no longer theirs to endure from across thin walls. For Mary, the silence he left behind was heavier than his presence had been. Alone now, she braced herself. The larder was near empty, the tools worn from neglect. The girls looked to her with wide eyes that did not understand what had gone or what remained. Each morning she rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and set about keeping them alive with what little she had, chopping kindling with an axe long past sharp, stitching clothes with thread almost gone, boiling thin soup from bones that had already given all their flavor. Survival was not new to her, but now the burden was hers alone. It was in those days of gray snow and weary breath that a stranger came riding into town. He was not young, nor old, but carried years in the set of his shoulders and the deep lines carved by sun and sorrow. His horse was as weathered as he was, its hide dulled by long miles across open country. His name, the townsfolk soon learned, was Samuel, a widowed cowboy who had lost his wife to fever seasons before, and who had never found cause to bind himself to one place since. He came for supplies, for work, perhaps for nothing more than a warm meal and a roof for a night. Yet when he entered the trading post, his path crossed Mary's. She was there with her daughters, bartering with quiet desperation, her hand steady though her eyes revealed the strain of stretching every coin. Her girls trailed behind her like sparrows, silent, watchful, their small hands tugging at her skirts. Samuel's gaze lingered, not with intrusion, but with recognition. In their silence he saw his own. In their guarded eyes he remembered the hollow echo of his cabin after his wife's passing. The way loneliness had filled every corner louder than laughter once had. Something stirred in him then, a long-buried ache. He did not speak to her that day. He merely tipped his hat, his voice roughened by disuse as he thanked the storekeep. But as he left, he glanced once more at the woman with her daughters, and she, though she did not meet his eyes, felt the weight of being seen, not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as a person. When Mary returned home through the snow, her arms full of meager supplies, she thought of the stranger's weathered face. She dismissed it quickly, telling herself she had no room for strangers, no room for hope. Yet that night, as she tucked her daughters beneath patched quilts and sat by the hearth with the fire burning low, she felt a shift in the air. The world had taken one man from her life and brought another across her path. It was too soon to name it, too fragile to trust. But something had changed. The grave still stood, a mound beneath the snow. The stranger had passed by, leaving behind no more than a memory of a gaze. And Mary, sitting with her shawl drawn tight and her daughters sleeping beside her, felt for the first time in years that her story might not be finished with sorrow. The wind that evening cut sharp as a blade, carrying with it the bitterness of a winter not yet ready to release its hold. Mary had walked to town with her daughters, their shawls pulled tight, their boots sinking into half-frozen mud. She entered the trading post with her head lowered, her purse lighter than her need. Inside, the smell of kerosene and dried goods clung to the air. Mary laid what little she had upon the counter, a pair of worn gloves to barter, a jar of preserves saved too long. She pressed for flour, salt, a length of thread. The storekeep, pity shadowing his face, gave her less than she asked. She did not protest. She gathered the small bundle and left in silence, her daughters trailing behind like sparrows seeking crumbs. At the edge of town, where the lanterns gave way to open dark, Samuel stepped from the shadows. His hat was pulled low, his hands bare against the cold. He did not block her path, only stood there with the quiet weight of a man who had thought long before speaking. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, shaped by gravel and wind, "I've watched you carry more than one soul ought to. A woman alone with 3 young ones. It ain't right for you to bear it all. Mary stiffened, clutching the bundle closer. She had no patience for charity, no strength left for pity disguised as kindness. "I don't take handouts," she replied, her words firm, though her breath trembled in the cold. Samuel's gaze did not falter. "I didn't offer charity." He paused, searching her face as though measuring her heart against his own. "I offer myself. My work, my hands, my name if you'll have it. Not for your sake alone, for theirs." He nodded toward the girls who stood half hidden in her skirts, their eyes wide in the lantern glow. "Then let me raise them with pride." The words hung between them, fragile yet unyielding like the thin ice that coated the river, a thing that could break or hold. Mary's heart recoiled. To trust another man? To open the door she had spent years bolting shut? Every bruise, every blow, every whispered insult rose up like ghosts around her. She had vowed never again to place her daughters beneath the power of another. And yet, she studied his face. Scarred and weathered, it bore no disguise. His eyes, though lined with grief, held no hunger for ownership. His posture spoke of patience, steady, unhurried, like the rocking of a chair on a quiet porch. The girls shifted. Eliza, the eldest, peeked out from behind her shawl, her gaze lingering on Samuel's rough hands, hands that looked strong enough to mend a fence, but gentle enough to lift a child. Little Anna's fingers toyed with the hem of Mary's skirt, while the youngest clutched her rag doll, her eyes darting between her mother and the stranger. Mary's silence stretched. The firelight from a nearby homestead flickered across Samuel's face, softening its harshness. She heard no false note in his words, no echo of the cruelty she had known. Instead, she heard something she had nearly forgotten existed: reverence. Not for her beauty nor for her labor, but for the dignity of her children. Still, the decision weighed heavy. Trust was not a garment easily mended once torn. She felt the scars along her ribs ache with the memory of betrayal. Could she risk it again? At last she spoke, her voice quiet but unshaken. "I cannot promise you trust, not yet. It was beaten out of me long ago. All I have are these girls, and all I ask is that no harm ever comes to them from your hand." Samuel bowed his head, as if her words were a vow he was bound to as much as she. "Then let it be so, no harm. Only pride, if you'll allow me." The firelight crackled in the distance. The girls, shy but curious, stepped closer, their small faces turned toward the warmth of his presence. Mary did not answer him that night. She turned and walked her daughters home, the cold wind pulling at her shawl. But as they neared their cabin with its sagging roof and weary walls, she felt the weight of something new pressing against the ache of her heart. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was the faintest stirring of hope, a fragile ember in the ashes of long years waiting for breath enough to burn. Samuel did not rush his way into their lives. He moved with the patience of a man who knew loss, who had learned that some doors could only be opened slowly, and some wounds could not be touched at all. At first, he came only to mend what was broken. The sagging fence behind the cabin, long left to lean, was set upright beneath his steady hands. The chopping block, dull and splintered, was made useful again by his axe. Mary watched from the doorway, shawl wrapped tightly, her daughters clinging to her skirts. She said little, her heart divided between gratitude and fear. But the sound of his work, the measured rhythm of axe against wood, the creak of rails settling into place, carried into the cabin like a language she had almost forgotten, the sound of steadiness. Samuel did not press himself upon them. He spoke little at first, and when he did, it was most often to the girls. He showed Eliza how to hold a rifle with respect, never pointing, never careless. He lifted Anna onto his horse and taught her how to sit tall in the saddle, her laughter ringing out into the cold air. Even the youngest, still clinging to her rag doll, he taught small lessons. How to watch the sky for storms, how to understand that thunder was no curse but only the sky speaking loudly. Winter deepened. Hunger pressed close, and the night seemed endless. The wind howled at the shutters, and the snow piled against the door, threatening to trap them inside. Yet within the cabin, something began to shift. The laughter of children returned, hesitant at first, then freer, bouncing from the walls that had so long known silence. By firelight, Samuel told stories of his wife, gone to fever years before. He did not speak of her as a saint nor as a wound, but as a woman he had loved and lost. He let the girls see that sorrow could be carried without cruelty, that grief was not a weapon but a weight a man bore with dignity. Mary, from her chair by the hearth, listened in quiet wonder. She had known grief too, but never as something shared. Her husband's sorrows had been spilled into anger, poured out upon her. Samuel's grief was different, worn openly, honestly, teaching her daughters that pain could be endured without striking another. One night, when Eliza sat on the floor before him, Samuel took up her braid and, with rough but careful fingers, retied it. Mary's breath caught. It was such a small act, so ordinary, yet it struck her like thunder. She saw how gently he worked, how he paused when the ribbon tangled, how he asked Eliza if it felt too tight. The sight of it, a man's hands braiding with care, was more rebellion than any rifle fired. He spoke to Anna as though her thoughts mattered, nodding gravely at her small opinions, asking questions that drew her into the circle of firelight. He even listened to the youngest, who told him nonsense with all the seriousness of a child. Each act was a quiet defiance against the shadow of Mary's past, and yet Mary could not surrender her caution. When snow rattled against the windows and the cold crept into her bones, old memories ached alongside it. Her scars, though hidden beneath layers of wool, seemed to throb with the weight of all she had endured. Could this peace be trusted? Could this man truly be different, or was she only fooling herself, hungry for kindness? Samuel seemed to sense the battle within her, though she never spoke it aloud. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing. He worked, he taught, he told his stories, and when evening came, he left them in peace. His patience was as steady as the rocking of a chair. Never hurried, never breaking stride. One night, as the fire burned low and the girls slept huddled together, Mary sat awake, watching Samuel doze in the chair by the hearth. His hat tilted forward, his scar catching the glow of the embers. She studied him in the silence, the lines worn deep in his face, the way his hands rested open, unthreatening. And she realized with a start that her shoulders had softened, that for the first time in years she was not bracing for a blow. The winter was far from over. Hunger still pressed, and storms would come again. But within the cabin, amid the crackle of firewood and the quiet rise and fall of her daughter's breathing, Mary felt something stir inside her chest. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was the faintest easing of fear, and in its place a fragile seed of hope waiting for spring. Peace, fragile as frost, did not come unchallenged. It was late in the season when the snow still clung to the earth, though spring threatened at the edges. The evening light fell pale across the yard, blue shadows stretching long. Mary had just set bread near the fire when the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Her heart clenched at once. Few visitors came this far, and fewer still unannounced. When she stepped onto the porch, shawl drawn close, she saw him. Her husband's brother. The resemblance was there, though twisted. The same sloping shoulders, the same hard mouth, yet lined with deeper malice. His eyes shone with the dull gleam of drink, and his breath carried it sharp. He sat heavy in the saddle, rifle slung careless across his back. "Well, Mary," he called, his voice rough. "I reckon this land's mine now. Blood runs thicker than your pity. And those girls." His gaze lingered too long on the doorway where Eliza and Anna peered out. "They've a name that's mine as well. You can't keep what belongs to kin." Mary's blood ran cold. Her knees trembled as if the years had folded back upon themselves, dragging her once more beneath the weight of blows and threats. But before fear could root her still, Samuel stepped from the barn. He moved without haste, his rifle already in his hands, held not as a boast, but as a promise. His voice cut through the dusk, steady as stone. "You'll not take land that isn't yours. And you'll not lay claim to children you never cared for." The air between them thickened. Snow drifted soundlessly, catching the last light, the world suspended in that narrow space where words might turn to bullets. Mary's brother-in-law spat into the snow. "You think to stop me, cowboy? You've no right." Samuel did not waver. "I need no right but theirs." He nodded toward the girls, who clutched their mother's skirts with white-knuckled fists. "They've chosen their place, and it isn't with you." Mary trembled, but not as before. This time her shaking was not surrender, but awakening. For years she had bent beneath cruelty. But now, as the snow fell and Samuel's voice rang steady, something within her spine straightened. She stepped forward, placing herself between the man and her daughters. "You'll not touch them," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Not now." "Not ever," the man sneered, shifting in his saddle. For a heartbeat, Mary feared he might draw his rifle. But he saw in Samuel's stance, in Mary's eyes, that the ground no longer belonged to him. His grip faltered, his bravado slipping like mud in thaw. With a curse, he turned his horse. The sound of hooves faded into the growing dark until only the hush of snow remained. Silence settled heavy over the yard. Samuel lowered his rifle, but his eyes lingered on the road long after the man was gone. Mary's hands shook, yet her heart pounded not with terror but with something fiercer: defiance. They gathered inside, the fire crackling loud in the stillness. The girls huddled close, their faces pale, but Mary smoothed their hair with a steadiness she had not felt in years. For the first time, she realized she had not stepped back. She had not yielded. In the glow of the flames, she saw her daughter's eyes wide with wonder, not fear. She saw Samuel sitting close, his presence quiet but unbreakable. And she understood. The shadow that had ruled their lives was gone. They were shaken, yes, but unbroken. And in that moment, Mary knew a truth she had not dared believe. They were no longer living in fear. Spring came slowly, as if the land itself needed time to believe in gentleness again. Snow retreated in ragged patches across the prairie, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. Shoots of green pierced the thawing soil, and wildflowers spread like quiet fire across the hills. In that season of renewal, Mary found her own spirit stirring, tender and unsure, yet alive. The cabin no longer felt like a place of shadows. Its walls, once echoing with silence and fear, now held laughter. In the mornings, Mary sat her daughters down and braided their hair, not with trembling hands, but with peace. She tied ribbons into their braids, not the faded ones of the past, but new ones Samuel had bartered for in town, bright as the dawn. The girls ran through the grass with skirts flying, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Samuel worked nearby, sleeves rolled, mending a plow or sharpening tools dulled by winter's weight. He moved with the patience of one who had known loss and learned not to hurry what must take its time. There was no ceremony, no single day that declared a new life had begun. Instead, it was a quiet weaving, shared meals, small lessons, evenings spent by the fire while the wind pressed gentle against the cabin walls. Samuel did not try to replace the man who was gone. He became something truer, a protector, yes, but also a teacher, a figure who showed the girls that their voices mattered, that their steps upon the earth were steady and sure. In his care, pride was no longer a thing denied but freely given. Mary watched him with wary gratitude at first, then with something deeper, something she did not rush to name. Each time she saw him bend to Anna's height to listen to her story of the day, or braid Eliza's hair with clumsy gentleness, she felt the bruised chambers of her heart knit together. The land itself seemed to bless the change. The rocking chair on the porch became her altar of reflection. She would sit with her shawl draped loosely, not as armor but as comfort, listening to the wind comb the grass, the sound of hammers from Samuel's hands mingling with the high voices of her children. Where once she had whispered promises of love they might never know, now she saw them living those promises beneath the open sky. One evening, when the day softened into gold and the hearth fire painted the cabin walls with its glow, Mary found her voice rising from a place long silent. She turned to Samuel, her hands folded in her lap, her daughters asleep in their bed. "You have given them what I could not," she said, her voice hushed yet steady. "You have given them pride." Samuel looked at her then, the firelight catching in the lines of his scarred face. He did not smile in triumph, nor did he soften into pity. He simply met her gaze, and his answer came quiet and sure, as if it had always been waiting. "We have given it together." The words settled deep within her, richer than any vow spoken in church, stronger than any paper bond. It was not one person saving another, but two lives, broken and weathered, choosing to carry the burden side by side. That night, as the fire burned low and the world outside hushed into spring stillness, Mary lay down knowing her daughters would wake not to fear but to a home built of dignity, and in that truth at last she rested.